Hello, welcome to chapter 2 of my first book in my fantasy trilogy. This book is called The Living Isle, and in chapter 2 we are meeting a new character called Talia for the first time. So let's go. And I am going to be scrolling, so I'll try and hide it a little bit, maybe if I do that. Yeah, okay. Today was the day I'd spent my whole life waiting for, and it was going exactly as I'd planned it. Moving to Highwick Village was something I'd always wished to accomplish, but had always felt like a dream from here in Rindle, where it smelt more like fish than a promising future. I wasn't sad to be leaving Rindle. This place never felt like home for me. I opened the latch of the sash window of my second floor bedroom and, pulling it up, let the salty air fill my nostrils one last time. I'd never gotten used to that smell, instead letting it serve as a constant reminder that if I worked hard enough, one day I could leave this stinky, messy, tiresome village behind for the fresh air of the castle grounds on the hill. And today was that day. We were finally moving to the place my family deserved to live. I wore my tidiest, hand-embroidered floral dress and had pulled my thin brown hair into a plait that lay between my shoulder blades, tied with a silken red ribbon. All that was left of the furniture in my room was my bed, floor-length mirror, and the empty desk I'd spent my nights doing homework at. The rest of my belongings, as well as the belongings of my father, mother, and sister, had already been moved to the new house in Highwick, ready for us to arrive this afternoon. I'd packed up the last of my clothes late last night, in an excitable rush, not able to sleep. All I'd ever wanted was for this day, and now it was here. Since I was a young girl, I'd practiced how I would bow when we were brought in front of the royal family, how I would graciously thank them for giving my family a house in Highwick Village, where valued residents of our isle lived in order to best serve and assist the royals with whatever they needed. Since my mother was an excellent nurse and my father an accomplished businessman, as well as my sister Sophie being a driven nurse in training and I an exemplary school student, it made sense that now was the time for us to be given this privilege. I was giddy with nerves and stood in front of my mirror, practicing my gentle, gracious smile so that it would be perfect when we met the royal family. I curtsied to myself, repeating the movement I'd repeated thousands of times to make sure it looked just right. To know I would be standing in front of the most powerful family on Durna later today was an honour. To be asked to live in the village they had hand-selected of sophisticated, educated residents would be the biggest honour of my life. To make things even more exciting, later this week I'd finally get to watch the annual royal flyover from the top of Highwick Castle. If the royal carriage arrived soon, it might be timed just perfectly enough for the people leaving their homes for work and school to watch us being taken away. The people of Rindle, fishermen, businessmen, nurses, children, would gaze up at us and wish that one day they might be lucky enough to move to Highwick Village. But it wasn't luck. Everything we were about to get had been because of our own doing. It was our years of hard work and focus that had led us here, and I wanted everyone to see. I squealed as the sound of horses' hooves clopping on the stone street outside echoed off the tightly packed houses through my window. It was like a victory song, telling me I'd made it. They were coming. Sophia raced past my open bedroom door from her room and I followed her into the hall, filled with bubbling anticipation, and down the stairs that twisted down into our cramped, dull living space. Morning light seeped in through the open door and I ran to join Sophia in the doorway. But she'd stopped with her feet on the threshold like she didn't want to step outside. The warmth and fulfillment I had felt all morning, all week, drained out of me in a matter of moments when I saw her face, pale and shocked. I pushed past her out into the street to see my mother and father standing in front of the carriage that had come to a halt on the cobblestones right outside my house. This was no royal carriage. There was no glistening black marble outer or gleaming wooden wheels. This carriage was not being driven by a royal guard dressed in crisp black attire or pulled by toffee-coloured Clydesdales with glistening coats and feathery white hair over their hooves. The carriage, which took up most of the width of the lane, was sun-beaten and lopsided, and more like a wagon with a cage on the back. The driver was wearing black, but unlike the royal guards, his leathers looked as though they could crumble apart and drift away with a strong wind, and the wisps of hair that fell out from under the hood concealing his face was slick and untrimmed. The black horses' hooves were caked with set mud, and the muzzles on their mouths clunked as they shook their heads around to get the flies off their ears and eyes. The stench was foul, and I had to stop myself from covering my nose. I'd only seen this carriage a couple of times on the rare occasion when someone had stolen from the market one too many times. This was the prison carriage. Why was it parked outside my house, today of all days? I marched forward to my parents to demand to know what was happening. "What's going on?" I asked my mother, who stood closest to me. She didn't reply, just shook her head. Both her and father were looking at the carriage with a surprising stillness, which did nothing to calm the dread that was unfurling inside me. People were poking their heads out of nearby doorways, and a small audience had formed around the carriage. This was not part of the plan. A well-dressed man, around the same age as my father, stepped out from the enclosed part of the carriage. He sniffed the air and screwed up his face. He was not from around here. He wore a soft brown tunic and cotton pants with shiny tan boots, and his skin was pale and plump, like he'd spent a lot of time lounging and eating. The man walked straight up to my father and handed him a scroll, sealed with a royal sigil stamp, a Carnaby bird with its white wings spread in flight, surrounded by a ring of blue, like our isle surrounded by the sea. I could recognize that sigil anywhere. I'd drawn and traced it on my books for years. My father peeled back the waxy stamp and unrolled the paper, expressionless. His eyes scanned the paper before he bowed his head and closed his eyes for a moment, before rolling up the paper and handing it back to the man. Without a word, father walked to the back of the carriage where the cage was. The man unhooked the rusty lock and my father climbed in. My eyes darted from my father to my mother, to the man who had locked him in, to Sophia, still standing like a statue in the doorway. The man slammed the cage and locked my father in. I ran forward, gripping my fingers around the greasy metal bars that surrounded my father. "Father, what's happening?" I cried. He looked down at the bottom of the cage, covered in rough wooden boards, not saying a word. My mother came up beside me and tried to pry my fingers from the bars. "Stop that, Talia," she hissed at me. Her face had blanched and her hands were sweaty, but I didn't budge, just held on tighter, my heart racing, my head spinning. The well-dressed man from the castle looked down at me and simply said, "Move away." But I wasn't going anywhere without an explanation. Something was very wrong here. "There's been a mistake. Why are you taking him? We're meant to be going to Highwick." I said, "Move away," the man shouted, causing gasps and whispers to rise from the people watching. He was looking at me like I was a leaf stuck on the wheel of the carriage, and I would not allow it. "How dare you treat my father in such a way? I demand you let him out right now and apologize. Don't you know who he is?" The well-dressed man snickered and smirked at the hooded driver, who sneered at me from inside the shadow of his hood. When the well-dressed man turned back to me, his eyes were dark and steady. "I know exactly who this man is. Now step aside, or you will find yourself in there too." I was ready to continue my argument, but two pairs of hands wrapped around my arms, and Mother and Sophia pulled me back towards the house. The well-dressed man climbed into the carriage and closed the door. The hooded man cracked his whip and the horses stepped forward. With a creak and a moan, the carriage began to roll forward, sending people scattering to the sides of the street and back into doorways. It was too wide to turn around here. It would have to do a loop of the main streets to get out of Rindle. Everyone in town would see my father in that cage. Everyone would wonder what was going on, just as I was. The street was now full of villagers, gaping at my father and whispering and pointing, which made me want to scream or throw up my breakfast. They looked at my father like he was some sort of criminal. He didn't look up as the carriage set off. I've never seen him look so ashamed. "What are you all staring at?" I yelled over my shoulder as Mother and Sophia pleaded for me to come back inside. Some villagers moved away, pretending to go about their days, but I knew they would all be talking about us, about my family, and what they had seen. It wouldn't take long before the whole village knew about this horrible mistake, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it from happening. Our own neighbours, people we passed every day, were watching my family like we were some sort of performance for them to scrutinise, like we'd just done all of this for their entertainment. This was not the sort of display I'd expected on the street today, and this was not what I'd ever imagined the day we moved to Highwick would turn into. My head spun as I returned inside, shaking my head in disbelief. Mother shut and locked the door, then closed the short curtains above the kitchen bench. Neither Mother or Sophia said a word, just sat down at the dining table and stared at the tablecloth. "We have to do something," I shouted. "We have to help Father." Our belongings were piled in the centre of the room in bags and suitcases. The contents of the kitchen, bookshelves and cupboards all packed up and ready to move. All that was left downstairs was the dining table and an old lumpy couch. Then it hit me. Were we trapped here now? With my father being carted away, what would happen to our plans to move to Highwick? It was like my life was thrown open to chance, and the lack of information or any forward moving was driving me mad. I slammed my hand down on the dining table, rattling the box of crystal serveware packed up on the top. Mother and Sophia looked up at me in shock. "Why won't one of you say something?" I screamed. Tears filled Mother's eyes. "That's enough, Talia," she whispered harshly before breaking down entirely, covering her mouth with her hand and running up the stairs. Sophia pursed her lips and stood stiffly from the table. "You should get ready for school," she muttered. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "School?" I gaped, throwing my hands out in exasperation. "You're telling me to get ready for school when our father was just taken away in a prison carriage? We are meant to be starting our new life today. Why won't anybody tell me what's going on?" Sophia bent over the pile of belongings and pulled her suitcase out. She unzipped it and brought out her slightly creased nurse's uniform, unfolding and smoothing it between her hands. "Until we can find out what to do, we must continue as normal." "Normal?" I exclaimed, shaking my head. "You are unbelievable. How can you expect me to act normal when none of this makes any sense? This is the most shameful thing to have ever happened to our family. I simply can't act normal." Sophia slung her nurse's uniform over her arm and walked over to me slowly. My hand was still flat on the table. I needed something to steady me. "Acting out will only bring us more shame." "But they are putting shame on us by doing this to Father," I said, moving my hand to grip the back of a dining chair. Sophia's hand ran over the length of her uniform, like she was stroking a cat. "We must act with poise, composure, and most of all strength. We will show everyone that we are worthy of respect, even in the face of such a situation. We cannot have our family name slanted even further, no matter how wrong this may seem to you." Though all I wanted to do was kick and scream and tell every single person in the whole town to mind their own business, Sophia was right. If I went out there screaming and yelling at some high-up person from Highwick Castle, it would not be a good look for us. It would mean any possibility of moving to Highwick as planned, once this mess was cleared up, would dissolve into the salty air. I still gripped the dining chair, my knuckles white, but I nodded my agreement. There was no other choice but to continue on like nothing had happened, at least in the presence of other villagers. But I would not forget this morning, for as long as I lived. I would find out what was going on, and I would make sure that justice was done to whoever wrongly sought out my father's arrest. That piece of paper the man had handed my father, it bore the royal sigil. Had the request come directly from the king? Everything had flipped on its head. Was it possible that the king who had invited us to live in his village now wanted my father in jail? I couldn't think any more of it, or what that might mean, or I was going to lose my mind. Digging in the pile of bags, I found my own suitcase and pulled out my school pinafore, holding it up to Sophia to show her that I was going to play along. She nodded with satisfaction and hurried upstairs to change into her nurse's uniform. I was almost impressed by how well she was masking her emotions. This must have been just as much of a shock for her as it was for me. She'd always been like that, since we were little. If there was ever a disagreement between our parents, or between the two of us, she would disappear into her room and emerge hours later calm and collected. I could not say the same for myself, but why should I have to sit by and let things happen to me that I didn't agree with at all? Still, I would heed my sister's words for now and remain quiet for the sake of our family. Completely disheartened, I let my beautiful embroidered dress fall off me into a tangle on the floor in front of my mirror. My white school blouse sat awkwardly under my grey pinafore, and I shuffled around in an attempt to get it to sit properly. I never thought I'd have to wear this horrible, boring uniform again. In Highwick, students have private tutors that come to their house, and they could wear whatever they pleased. I would have had a seamstress to make a new dress for me each day of the week, but nothing too loud or busy. There was still my reputation to consider as a top student, so the colours and cuts would have been fashionable and dignified. Nothing like this horrible Rindle school uniform. The only reason I'd packed it was because I didn't want to face having to hand it down to one of the younger girls in the village, the only ones that would be able to fit my current size. Perhaps I would have thrown it into the fire once I'd reached Highwick Village, but would I ever be able to now? Flopping down onto the window seat, I glanced down at the street. It looked like nothing unusual had happened. People walked to work along the cobblestones. Children and teenagers walked towards our school at the bottom of the village by the cliff's edge, and vendors pulled carts from their homes down to the marketplace. But as they walked beside their friends and neighbours, their mouths moved relentlessly, and I knew the words would be about my family. I slammed the window down and closed the curtain. Though nothing about my physical appearance had changed except for my dress, I now felt 2 feet shorter after this morning's events. I was small already, dainty, some might say, but I despised that word. It implied weakness, and I was not weak. Many people thought that I was younger than I was, and up until a few years ago, if Sophia and I were at the market together or walking down the hill to school, they only ever addressed her. It was like I was invisible to them because I was small. That was until I decided to change things. One morning a few years ago, my family was gathered at the dining table. Before Mother had left for work at the hospital up the hill, she had written out a list for Sophia to take to the market. I was to go along and assist by reading out the list, since I'd been a proficient reader since a young age, but Sophia was expected to carry the basket back. "Remember not to give your sister anything too heavy to carry, Sophia," Mother had instructed. My face had scrunched up in a ball. I could carry the whole basket, but she never lets me. "Of course you could, darling," Mother smiled and kissed each of us on the head, including Father, who was reading the paper before rushing off to work. Sophia had gone upstairs to change, and I sat sulking at the table. "Why don't you do it?" Father had said, sipping the last of his tea. "Do what?" I'd huffed, head leaning on my hands. "Take the list, take the basket, and get the food. Don't let them tell you that you can't. Show them that you can." Someone whistled outside and Father stood, folding up his paper and dropping it onto the table. The carriage that took him up the hill to work was waiting for him outside. While Mother also worked up the hill, she'd always liked the walk before her shift. Patting me on the head, Father left, and would be gone all day, not getting back until Sophia and I were asleep. Swinging my feet below the table, my feet nowhere near reaching the floor, I lifted my head, considering what Father had said. I'd known I could do the shopping. It was everyone else that didn't think I could. Father had been right. The only way to prove that I was stronger than they thought was to show them. So I'd snatched up the list, as well as the pouch of money Father had left out for Sophia, and with the basket in my hand, marched down the hill towards the square. The crowds of people loomed over my head, but I pushed down any fear that I'd had about Sophia not being there holding my hand. Consulting our list, I pushed my way to the front of each stall, raising my voice over the other voices that tried to cut me off. Eventually, and with some hesitancy, each vendor gave me what I'd asked for, and I hauled the heavy basket back up the hill with me. I had to stop several times as the fish, vegetables, and baking supplies weighed me down. Sophia had come running down the hill, and when she spotted me, she ran to me looking relieved and afraid. She'd wrapped her arms around me like I was a pathetic little porcelain doll. "You must wait for me. What will Mother say when she finds out you went off on your own?" I'd pushed her away and continued up the hill with the basket, my little arms shaking under its weight. I didn't let Sophia take the basket from me and made it home, grinning ear to ear. When Sophia inevitably told Mother what I'd done, she had been disappointed in me, telling me I shouldn't have been so reckless. But the next morning at the table, Father congratulated me on my first ever solo outing, and I smiled proudly. Ever since that day, I had never let anyone decide what I couldn't do. Now, I was going to have to face a reprise of the days people had made me feel small. But just as I had back then, I wouldn't allow it. My father would want me to show everyone that I was stronger than they thought I was. I clenched my fists, and when I released my grip, I looked at myself in the mirror. My small frame meant nothing, and what had happened to Father wouldn't hold me back from being a success. I was going to show them. So, that is chapter 2, the introduction to Talia's story. I hope you're enjoying it. Leave me some feedback, and see you next time.